right. So we're going to kind of take it back to the origins that I referenced earlier, just to kind of give you a bit more context, deeper context. When we're talking about risk communication, I mentioned before that it is really rooted in this dialogue between government, industry, public entities, private entities, and the general public. So back in the 1970s, the public played this passive role in environmental policy, and their preference, as I mentioned earlier, was to defer to more established public health institutions. And so, for an example of this is the outbreak at Fort Nix in New Jersey, where there was a flu outbreak, and the government made a decision to vaccinate everyone. Man, woman, child. That's what some of the literature describes. And people just went along with it. But by the 80s, people began to get involved in environmental policy making. There became more of an awareness of saving the earth, saving the planet, global climate change, and things of that nature. For example, this image here is an image of stamps back in the 80s that was sort of developed to celebrate the development of Earth Day, right? So the cities throughout the country were experiencing a number of public health issues like smog and pollution, water contamination, et cetera. And so as people are learning about these different issues that are happening in their communities, one of the fundamental dilemmas of risk communication is recognizing that there are risks that can have, deathly outcomes, and then there are risks that just harm people. And understanding that how we communicate about these different risks is going to vary because not all risks are the same. And much of this has to do with one's perception of risk and the outrage that can result depending on how severe one perceives the risk. So in thinking about this notion of risk and harm and hazards, how do people understand and negotiate the risks and harms that are in our lives every day? And so on the next slide, we have a few examples just to kind of give you this historical timeline of some things that have happened over the decades. Back in 1952, there was this fire in Ohio. It's actually a river that flows through Cleveland, Ohio, I believe. And what was happening was there was oil spillage happening into this river. And this wasn't the first time that this had happened, but it happened so many times and became a very serious health consequence because of water contamination for water that is being used to flow into people's homes that they cook with and drink and whatnot. So that was a big issue that happened back in 1952. In Los Angeles, toward the end of the 50s, smog became a very serious issue. This image in the bottom is from a protest from a campaign called Stamp Out Smog, a campaign that was started by several housewives who, if you look at the picture on the top right corner, this is an image of people who live in the hills, for example, and looking down to downtown LA. And here you can see the thick layer of smog. And this was a result of more automobiles on the road and traffic and things like that, right? So we see like production of automobiles and what it produced with smog. With the river fire, this was, an industrial issue as more industries were, planting their roots in Ohio. They were dumping waste into the river. And then this last picture at the bottom is just another example of industrial pollution. Again, this is related to the Cleveland picture on the far left. So it shows you this timeline for Cleveland, for example, of how long this issue has been happening. So these are just a couple of examples to kind of show you where these environmental issues were developing into communities getting involved and taking their rightful role in the policymaking.
So these next couple of slides are going to get us thinking in the language of risk and risk communication. So when we are talking about risks and risk communication, sometimes we hear the word risk and sometimes we hear the word hazard. So what's the difference between those two things, and why does that matter for risk communication and risk perception? So a hazard is something that could potentially cause harm. And the key word here is potentially. A hazard does not automatically cause harm. There has to be some sort of exposure to that hazard that would lead to a risk or the potential for harm. A risk is the probability that harm will occur when a person is exposed to that hazard. So these are some of the more technical terms that we use in risk communication to describe something that could potentially cause harm, and then the probability that a harm will occur, or the likelihood that a harm will occur when a person becomes exposed to a particular hazard. So here we're just going to do a couple of quick fun little exercises to get us sort of, understanding these conceptual differences. So here we have a picture of a shark. And so take a second here to think about whether or not this shark here is a hazard or a risk. The answer is hazard. So the shark is not a risk to us unless we're swimming in the ocean where the sharks are present, and perhaps even where it's common that they are predating on seals or other animals like that. Otherwise, they don't pose a risk to us. So if you're swimming in Lake Michigan, this shark here is not a risk. It's a hazard. You're not going to encounter a shark in Lake Michigan. So this is starting to demonstrate here that there's a difference between a hazard and a risk, and that difference is whether or not I'm coming into contact with the thing that could potentially cause harm. So we have a couple other examples here. So here we have a picture of some cooling towers at a nuclear power facility. And do you think that these are a hazard or a risk? So the answer here is a hazard. There would be a risk to us if there was a leak or a spill of some kind, or a meltdown, or potentially a security breach that would impact the integrity of this facility. But as it stands, if it's in good function, it's a hazard, and there's not an immediate risk to us. This picture here is a person swinging a swing over a gorge of some kind, over a deep area. Would you think that this is a hazard or a risk that we're seeing? So this is a risk. This person is swinging over a deep ravine with no harness or straps. There's some likelihood, don't know the exact likelihood, but some likelihood that they could fall off of this swing and injure themselves seriously or fatally. The swing on its own, if there were no person on it in this photograph, would be a hazard. But the person actually engaging with the swing and exposing themselves to this particular hazard puts them at risk of falling and injuring themselves. And so this is a risk that we're seeing here. And so again, this little exercise was just to demonstrate the difference between a hazard and a risk, and to get us familiar with this type of language that we might see in the risk communication space, and to know the difference in these technical terms. And so another question we have is, do any of these threats on the previous slide seem scarier to you than others? The answer is probably yes. A lot of people tend to think that nuclear power is very, very scary, and also sharks are really scary, but you might not automatically think that it's scary to be on a swing, even if it is over some high or deep gorge type situation. So one of the reasons why we need risk communication is because, as Dr. Floyd mentioned earlier, not all risks are the same, not all hazards are the same. Some things can cause a lot of harm and some things can cause a lot of alarm. And so our job as risk communicators is to help the people that we're communicating with understand where the big risks are, which things are more likely, and what types of things they're likely to be exposed to that they should be considering protecting themselves from. So really, we want to arm people to know how to protect themselves from hazards, minimize their risks, and have information about what to do if a crisis were to occur. This is the type of information that people need to be able to make independent decisions about risks to protect themselves. Again, we don't need to, we're not trying to coerce people, we're trying to arm people with information so that when they are facing a situation where they are at risk or others are at risk around them, there's a threat, they can protect themselves.
I really like the slides with the photos on them of the shark and the swinging over the ravine. I think that's a nice way to set up these next couple of slides, where I want to talk a little bit about the psychology of risk communication. When we're thinking about this topic in terms of risk communication is about communicating risk and threats to our safety and well-being. There will be an emotional component to that, depending on what that risk is or what that threat is. And so when we're thinking about threats, like for example, with the current pandemic, we're thinking about the way that it makes us feel, whether it's the current conversation around the vaccine, or if you think about this time last year when the pandemic was just beginning, how are we feeling and how are we behaving, right? And so when thinking about how we communicate risk, it's really important for you to, think about that process model that we saw earlier of knowing your audience, trying to understand, for example, how they feel during a crisis and how they may process information during a crisis is really important. So there are a couple of processes that we're going to talk about, emotional and cognitive, and I'll talk a bit more about cognitive processes in a bit when we get to, developing messages and whatnot. But, some things to think about when we're trying to convey important information related to a public health threat is that, people are going through a number of emotions. Like, there's this uncertainty. If it's a novel threat, like the current pandemic was novel. And with uncertainty comes fear, anxiety. People may feel that they are helpless, if they don't have enough information about the threat. And then there could be other situations that can have an impact on them that can cause stress. For example, many people lost their jobs or their employment was reduced because of COVID, depending on what type of industry they worked in. And then there are some people who had denial that, the pandemic was even real. And there are people, still, right? So there are a number of emotions that we have to be mindful of, because the way in which people are processing information during a crisis will determine the type of messaging that we want to share with those individuals. So take into consideration how people may, react to information when providing them with risk communication, but also understand that we really need to do our due diligence to communicate clearly and communicate well so that people can arm themselves with informed information so they can make an action, whether however they feel is best for them. So I want to talk a little bit more about, why we understand, risk communication and its importance to us. So we're going to move on to the next slide and talk about some evidence that underlies why we know what we know about risk communication and different communication practices.